This recording is an introduction to the motor pathways. Specifically, it's more of an introduction to the somatic motor pathways, but we're going to start by comparing the somatic versus the autonomic nervous system. Kind of, as you remember, the nervous system is broken up into two parts. You've got the central nervous system, which includes the brain and spinal cord, and then you have your peripheral nervous system that involves all those nerves. And we had two divisions. You had sensory and you have motor, and the one that we're going to be introducing is the somatic motor division. But I do want to compare that division versus the autonomic nervous system, was also referred to as the visceral nervous system or visceral motor division, because after we do somatic motor pathways, we'll be discussing the autonomic nervous system. So some of the things that we want to kind of compare between them, the targets are different. The somatic nervous system, the target is skeletal muscle, which is voluntary. The skeletal muscles will not contract unless it's told by that nervous system to do it. Now, the autonomic nervous system has two divisions, the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic nervous system, and the target organs are different. It's smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, could also even be adipose tissue. So the targets are different. When we just look at the muscle, the smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, remember those are involuntary muscles. Now, if you also look at other differences, is the location of cell bodies. In the somatic nervous system, the cell bodies are completely found within the central nervous system. However, with the autonomic nervous system, we actually have two neurons that we're going to talk about. There's a preganglionic and a postganglionic neuron. The preganglionic neuron you see here, and then we have a postganglionic neuron, which you see right here and right here, and they have cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons are located within the central nervous system. However, the cell bodies of postganglionic neurons are associated with ganglia, which is outside of the central nervous system. So there's a key difference too. Now, another thing that you'll notice is going to be some differences in neurotransmitters, and there'll also be a difference in effects. So I'm going to go to this picture, and so with the somatic nervous system, the neurotransmitter that you see down here by all these little red dots is acetylcholine, and that's the abbreviation for acetylcholine. The receptor on skeletal muscles that binds to acetylcholine is the nicotinic receptor, which is a ligand-gated sodium channel. The effects of acetylcholine binding the receptor result in an influx of sodium ions across the cell membrane, and if you have enough of that takes place, you will generate an action potential because a threshold potential will be reached. So the effects of this are always excitatory. When you have that somatic nervous system releasing that acetylcholine, it's always going to be excitatory. The muscle's going to contract. And here, this represents that skeletal muscle that you see. Now, in the autonomic nervous system, the preganglionic neurons, the neurotransmitter released by the synaptic knobs is acetylcholine. So it's acetylcholine here, and it's acetylcholine here, and they don't really show it, but by here it's also going to be acetylcholine. The receptors that you see on the postganglionic neuron are all nicotinic receptors. Okay, so those are nicotinic receptors. Now, when we look at the postganglionic neurons, the neurotransmitter will vary. Now, with the autonomic or with the parasympathetic nervous system, the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. Now this receptor though, right here, is not a nicotinic receptor. It's a muscarinic receptor. And muscarinic receptors are not ligand-gated ion channels. They're G protein coupled receptors, and there's multiple subtypes of them. And depending upon the muscarinic receptor that binds to the acetylcholine, the effects could be excitatory or inhibitory. Now with the sympathetic nervous system, the neurotransmitter released by the postganglionic neuron typically is norepinephrine. There'll be some exceptions when we do the autonomic nervous system. I'll talk about those exceptions, but typically it's norepinephrine, and the receptors are adrenergic receptors. But there's different types of adrenergic receptors. And you see like there's a beta 1 here that says beta 2, there's alpha 1, there's alpha 2. We'll talk about those different types of receptors. And again, these are G protein coupled receptors. There are like the muscarinic receptor, adrenergic receptors are receptors that have metabotropic effects. They're not ion channels. So they somehow will cause certain channels in the cell membrane to either open or close depending on what specific receptor is involved and the cell signaling mechanisms involved. And so the effects can be, again, excitatory or inhibitory, depending on the target. Now you'll notice over here, the adrenal actually is, or I should say the adrenal medulla, which is the inner part of the adrenal gland, that is part of the sympathetic nervous system. The adrenal medulla is actually a modified sympathetic ganglion. Now what happens here is it's pretty much lost its postganglionic neurons, lost their dendrites and like kind of lost their axons. So what happens is this structure actually just releases epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream, and they act as hormones. And most of it is actually released is epinephrine, and they bind to adrenergic receptors in certain targets. So we'll address this a little bit more in depth when we do the autonomic nervous system. Now, what we're going to start in the first series of recordings is talk about the somatic nervous system. Now, we'll predominantly discuss two motor neurons. We'll talk about upper motor neurons, and we'll talk about lower motor neurons. So upper motor neurons you see in the red, and the lower motor neurons are in the black. Now, depending on the particular pathway, the location of the upper motor neurons will differ. So if it's in the primary motor cortex, that's involved in the conscious or voluntary movement of skeletal muscles. But if the cell bodies of the upper motor neurons are located outside of that primary motor cortex, it will be involved in control of skeletal muscle, but at a subconscious level. We'll talk about this. I'm not just going to cross through it. We'll look at this in a different recording. Now, a couple things I want to make sure that you're aware of is all these motor pathways referred to as descending pathways. They will start up somewhere in the brain and then descend. If they go down the spinal cord, they're going to be located in either the lateral white columns or the anterior white column. The posterior white column only has ascending tracts, so we won't encounter those. But where you see colored are the different descending tracts, so the motor tracts that we'll talk about with the somatic motor pathways. Now, as a rule, the tracts in the spinal cord that run laterally, the ones that you see here, they control distal muscles. Those are muscles at the distant, they're further away in your limbs. They'll be involved in most of the voluntary movements of your arms and your legs. Now, the tracts that run Medially, all these ones here that you find in the anterior white column, they control axial muscle, so muscles associated with your trunk. They're going to be more coarse control, while these is more fine control over here. So they involved in control of posture and balance, and just coarse control of axial muscles, but also proximal muscles of the limbs, so closer to your trunk. Now, the one other thing I want to show you is kind of show you the motor homunculus versus the sensory homunculus. So remember, the homunculus is like a mapping. So in here, you're seeing the motor homunculus right here. Is you'll notice again where certain parts of your body, or the locations in here, in this case, the primary motor cortex, that is controlling certain parts of your body is located in certain places. So you'll notice the further things are down, starting from your toes, that's going to be found more where the longitudinal fissure is, more medially. As you move up, the further you go up your body, is you'll see it, it moves more laterally here. So closer to where your central sulcus, not central sulcus, sorry, your lateral sulcus is, you'll see more of your throat area is controlled. That's kind of important to kind of know the general location of the mapping. So if I say I stimulate that primary motor cortex right there, I would see some movement in a finger or the hand. If I say stimulate here, I want to see movement in the toes or the feet. Okay. Now you also notice there's certain parts of the body are exaggerated. So you notice you see especially here, look at the size of the hands. But it's also big in the sensory homunculus because your hands, your fingers have a lot of fine motor control. Also very important with sensory. Also bring your attention to what you'll notice is, what you'll notice on this model over here, you notice you don't see any ears, but here you do. This one has kind of bigger nostrils in there because you have more, the ears and the nostrils are more for sensory, not a lot for motor. Also bring your attention to that the sensory homunculus appears to have a penis, but this one doesn't, because the penis is more for sensory instead of motor. So kind of show you the little bit of difference. The big thing is the feet and the legs are not really big in the motor or the sensory. It's really those hands that have like the greatest ability for motor control, which is kind of interesting. Also look at this one. This one has, you see the teeth on there? Don't really see teeth because teeth have sensory function, but your teeth don't really move. So that's kind of to give you an idea about that. So this is all, actually here's another, just showing you the mapping. So again, the locations of things are the same, is the sizes of things may be a little bit different. So again, you see here you got the teeth and you got the lips more, not as much for lips over here. But you'll notice again that the feet are going to be more along that longitudinal fissure, and as you move further up the body, the mapping on the primary motor cortex is further over. Again, that primary motor cortex is in the precentral gyrus of your frontal lobe, and this is going to be only involved in conscious control of skeletal muscle movement. We'll talk about other pathways that are going to be part of subconscious control of skeletal muscle movement. And so the upper motor neurons will not be located in these regions here. They're going to be located somewhere associated with your brainstem.